I was backstage and one of the martial arts performers offered to give me their sword to come out here with to make me feel more comfortable, and it was tempting, but I decided that waving a sword at you probably was not the tone that I was trying to go for, so I left it backstage. Benjamin Franklin once said that any society that will sacrifice a little liberty for a little security will deserve neither and lose both. If you've listened to the news at all over the past several years, you've likely heard a lot of stories about the immigration system and how it's affecting our southern border specifically. And a lot of those narratives are positioned in an us versus them capacity. They're supported by arguments of a line item in a budget somewhere or a security threat level on a graph. But in June of 2019, I found myself in South Texas working with detained immigrants and confronted face-to-face with the immigration system, and what I can tell you is it was not a line item in a budget, it was a human being. And I started to ask myself a lot of questions from that experience, questions like, what role does our Constitution play in our society? What values do we hold true as a nation? Who is it that our Constitution is meant to protect? And equally as important, how do all of these questions relate to this group of people that we've deemed them? Now, I wish I could tell you at the end of this talk I'm going to provide you answers to all of those things. Spoiler alert, I'm not. I wish I had the answers to all of them. But what I really hope is that you use this as a jumping off point for a future conversation. That we provide perspectives throughout the course of this talk that you can use as a lens to reframe that narrative of us versus them to one of us versus ourselves. So as I said, in June of 2019, I found myself in South Texas, and I want to preface this by saying I'm not an immigration attorney by trade. I am a business attorney, so I spend significantly more time in boardrooms than I do in detention centers, but like many of you, I had seen a lot of stories about deplorable detention center conditions and family separations and long lines and injuries and even death, and I needed to see it firsthand. So when I had the opportunity and was provided an invitation to go to the border and provide counsel to detained immigrants, I jumped at the chance. And I had the opportunity throughout that week to work with a number of individuals that really helped to shape my perspective on the immigration system. But there's one story in particular that I want to share with you, and that is about a young man in his late 20s from Honduras. My role with him was to prepare him for his final hearing, which would occur on Friday of that week. The hearing where the judge would make a final determination as to whether he would be allowed to remain in the country or he would be sent home to Honduras. And I'm preparing him for this, which required a couple of things. One, it required to prepare him for the procedure that he would face, explain what was expected of him, and then also help him understand the case against him and help him craft his own case in response to that. And as I talked him through this process, I got to hear a lot of his own story. He had fled from Honduras. He had a beautiful wife and 2 young children that he loved very much. He was a business owner, like a lot of the individuals that I work with in my day-to-day practice. He had just bought a house. He had a lot of hopes and dreams for the future, and all of those things had been dashed by the crime and lawlessness that were pervading his home country. And so he made the difficult decision to seek safety in the United States, and the process of doing that was a harrowing journey unto itself. A lot of days spent wandering through the desert, unaware of where he would find food or water or shelter. And I listened to this story, and the humanity in me wept. And I sat across the table from him, and I looked into his eyes, and I wanted so badly to tell him that America was a safe place, that it was a place of freedom and justice, a place where the American dream was alive and well. And I sat there across the table from him in a detention center, surrounded by razor wire, staffed with armed guards, that he was not allowed to voluntarily leave even if he had chosen to go home. And let's keep in mind, he had not been charged or convicted of a crime. He had spent months in this detention center with little to no communication with the outside world. And I wanted to tell him all of these things about who we were as a nation and why the fight was worth it, but they all seemed really disingenuous. Because I sat there and I looked at a file that contained every experience he had had with the system, and that is not how we showed up as a nation. So we continued preparing for the hearing. And the day of the hearing came at the end of the week, and myself and another attorney arrived at the detention center that morning to attend the hearing. Most legal proceedings are public proceedings, and that's important. That's an important structural protection because it ensures that the public has oversight and overview as to the actions of the judiciary. But these particular proceedings are held within the detention center themselves, so you cannot access them without escort by a bailiff or an armed guard. And the bailiff begins to take myself and my colleague back to the hearing, and in the course of small talk, it becomes clear that he was under the impression that we were students. I know I look very young, but it's been a little while since I was a student. I appreciate the compliment. Once it became clear to him that we were attorneys, his entire demeanor changed. And we were escorted not to the courtroom, but back out to the general waiting area. And time passed, the time the hearing was supposed to start passed. Eventually he comes back out and tells us the judge would not allow us to attend the hearing. I was frustrated. In that moment, I was frustrated and scared and a little impatient. And so we told him. We had checked with the court, we had checked with the detention center, we had checked with department policy, and it had been told by all of those institutions that the defendant would be asked if he wanted us to attend. When he said yes, we would be allowed in. And we reiterated to the bailiff that we were very confident when the defendant was asked, he would want us present in the hearing. And the bailiff said, the judge has decided that you need written consent. Okay. My frustration level goes up a little, but a problem with a solution, right? The defendant's 10 feet away on the other side of a brick wall. We can go get his signed written consent and we'll have no problems. The judge says you needed to have written consent before you got here. This is in direct contradiction of department policy and of this court's policy. We respectfully requested, after reminding the bailiff of this, that the bailiff return and ask the judge to reconsider. Upon returning and upon the judge's reconsideration, his initial decision stood. We would not be allowed to attend the hearing. My frustration was at an all-time high, and my stomach dropped. This decision was arbitrary. It was made by an individual who had had complaints filed against them from multiple attorneys due to their failure to follow policy. And in that moment, absent something short of handing my personal effects to the other attorney and demanding to speak to the judge myself, which generally does not play out well, we had no other option. So we left the detention center, and when we checked on our client later that day, he had been ordered deported, sent back to an uncertain fate in the country from which he was fleeing. So that begs the question, what role does the Constitution play in our society? The Constitution is really the foundation upon which the rest of our structures and systems are built, and it's in the Constitution that we find all of those values that really identify who we are as a country. Things like equality and justice and freedom and due process. And all of the other systems and structures use those values as a touchstone, or at least they should. So who are these values meant to protect? Who is it the Constitution's meant to protect? The Constitution protects the community from the individual, but just as importantly, it protects the individual from the community. And that's where the Constitution has failed our immigration system. We've used and institutionalized over the decades fear and discrimination into this system which is meant to use the Constitution as a touchstone. We've allowed small pieces of liberty to be taken away in pursuit of some false sense of security. And as Benjamin Franklin told us, any society that sacrifices a little liberty for a little security will deserve neither and lose both. When we take liberties away from our most vulnerable populations, history tells us inevitably they will be taken away from us as well. So as a nation, we stand at a precipice. And that precipice has nothing to do with them and everything to do with us. Our constitutional values cannot exist on a sliding scale where they lose all meaning and value. Are we a nation that believes in equality and due process and justice, or are we not? Are we a nation that believes in the dignity and human worth of every individual, or are we not? Are we a nation that values our own Constitution, or are we not? Thank you.